Well, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Pastor.
Good morning.
So today we are going to be in part 2 of the Mosaic covenant. And this was actually a slide from last week, but the reason that I wanted this one is before we go, what we're going to be doing today mostly is going to be talking about the specific terms of the Mosaic covenant. But before we get into the specifics, I just want to review for a moment really 2 points that we talked about last week that I think we need to keep in our minds as we go into the specific details of the covenant itself. And there, we talked about them last week, but this is just sort of a review so it's on our mind. And the first one is to remember that this covenant, the Mosaic covenant, is a national covenant with the nation of Israel. It is not an individual covenant with individual people. We talked about this last week about how it is, in its nature, in its application, it is not about individual people's behavior, except for in as much as collectively it becomes the character of the whole nation. And so when God talks about both the positive and the negative things having to do with obedience and disobedience, it isn't talking about individuals, it's talking about how the nation as a whole relates to God and follows God's guidance. And even though this covenant, of course, is for Israel and does not have any specific relation to us in our country now, I do think there's the principle that if a nation and a nation's people follow God's principles, God will bless that nation. Even though we're not included in the Mosaic covenant, it's specifically to Israel, but yet I do think that there is an application for us. And the second thing is how we spent a lot of time talking about the hybrid nature of the covenant, specifically whether it's conditional or unconditional. And as we talked about last week, there are aspects of it that are conditional. Essentially, the covenant sets forth 2 different, you might say, parallel tracks that the nation of Israel could follow. And their choices as a nation determine which track they go on. And so to that extent, there's conditions. But once you are on that track, the promises that relate to that track are unconditional. In other words, once you are going down this road and God says, these are the consequences for those actions, then there's nothing you can do to change those consequences. It's unconditional once you are down that road. So, again, there's this hybrid aspect of the Mosaic covenant. So I want to keep those 2 things in mind as we get into the weeds and in the details of the covenant itself, the specific terms and conditions, you might say. Thinking about that dual nature and thinking about the overall context that this is a covenant to a nation, not individual people. Okay? So, the actual terms and conditions of the Mosaic covenant begin in Deuteronomy 28. And it begins with this introductory statement which defines that first track that we talked about. He says, if you, and again, when he's saying you, he's talking about the nation, not individuals. If you as a nation fully obey the Lord your God and carefully follow all his commands I give you today. So Moses introduces that first category of the promises, those which apply to the obedient nation. And remember, he's already, previous to this, as we talked about last week, given that second reading of the law. So Moses has given them another presentation of what the law is. Now, with that in mind, he is urging them then to follow, as a nation, those laws. So the if at the beginning of this verse is the basis of describing this covenant as a conditional covenant, because there is this if, and so therefore the other side of that is if then, if you don't make this decision, then there's a different consequence. So in that sense, there are conditions. But as we said before, the promises within this segment, and I'll call this Mosaic A, are unconditional and certain. So here's the first thing. The Lord your God will set you high above all the nations on earth. So this is kind of a summary statement, or a thesis statement at the beginning of the covenant, saying overall what the character of this covenant is. He's essentially, it's a summary of the details that are going to follow. The specific promises that he gives them are going to fall under this overall category. Because what he's saying, in essence, in summary, is that if you follow me, I will exalt the nation. So how does that manifest? Well, that manifests in some specific areas that he gets into. And we'll get that in a minute. Then he says, all these blessings will come upon you and accompany you if you obey the Lord your God. And that's in verse 2. So these promises are referred to in this scripture as blessings. The Hebrew word there, barak, means simply to benefit someone, to prosper someone, to make them happy. So God is saying that he is going to bless this nation who follows him, who follows his laws, which means he's going to prosper them. He's going to make them happy. He's going to meet their needs. He's going to provide the basis for their joy and their peace. So here's where I get into that whole hybrid nature of it, because even though there's the if statement that brings us down this road of if you obey, once you're here, he says the certainty of this promise is seen in that phrase, the blessings will accompany you, will come upon you and accompany you. There's no doubt that God will bless the nation. He's not going to change his mind or abandon the faithful. He's not, if his people are following his laws, he's not going to say 100 years down the road, I'm really tired of this. I found this other nation that I like better. They're better looking people or whatever it is. So I'm going to go with them. You guys are now on your own. Once, the nation goes down this road of faithful obedience, God will bless them and will not renege on those promises to bless them. So that is certain and unconditional. So here's where we get into some of the specifics that are examples of how he exalts the nation. The first thing he says in verse 3, you will be blessed in the city and blessed in the country. I think this is really interesting, and this is only my opinion. But to me, what this says is God is saying that these blessings are going to be for the entire nation. In other words, it's not going to be just for, the kings. It's not just going to be for the rich people in the city that run everything. It's going to be as much for the people that live in the city as it is for those ordinary people out there who are farmers, who are shepherds, who are ranchers, or whatever. Even the so-called peasants, God's blessings are for all the people. They're not just going to be for the rich elites that are in control of everything and have all the money. God's blessings are even going to be for that humble shepherd out in the country. It's the extent of God's blessings. He's going to bless all the nations. Secondly, he says in verse 4, the fruit of your womb will be blessed. And I think this speaks of two things. I think one thing, it's an extension of that promise in the Abrahamic covenant. When he told Abraham, I'll make your offspring like the dust of the earth. I think he is promising the nation that the population will grow, that they'll become a great nation in number. I think also in that, the fruit of your womb will be blessed. That also has that implication of like health and prosperity. And I think both of those are important for two reasons. Remember that at the point that God is making these promises to Israel, they have not occupied the land yet. This is before they go in. So when they go in and occupy the land, they have got to be prosperous in that land. And so at a time when they're trying to get a foothold and build a nation out of essentially nothing, the idea that God is promising that their population will grow and that their children will be healthy at a time when infant mortality was brutal, this is really a promise of an existential nature for the nation of Israel. It proves they're not going to die out, in other words. You're not going to go in the land and then die out and wither on the vine. The nation will grow in terms of population. The third thing he says in the second part of verse 3, the crops of your land and the young of your livestock. Once again, I think this really gets to the heart of the existential nature of the nation surviving. I mean, this is before technology and industry and all this. The lifeblood of their economy is agrarian. It's the farmers. It's those raising the livestock. That's what makes the nation go. That's the lifeblood of their existence. And so this promise that their crops and their livestock are going to be growing, are going to be blessed, is essentially that he's promising they'll survive, that they'll have prosperity and happiness, that they will be able to sustain themselves as a nation, and by extension that individual families will be able to sustain themselves. Now in verse 6, he makes this another very general statement where he says, you will be blessed when you come in and blessed when you go out. And I think this is it's one of these sort of summarizing statements that essentially says, everything you do, I will bless. In other words, he could go down a list and give 100 different examples of, I'm going to bless you when you do this thing, and I'm going to bless you when you do that thing. I'm going to bless you when you try this. I'm going to bless you when you try that. So essentially, it's kind of like, for lack of a better term, it's like the Midas touch. It's like everything you do and everything you touch, I will bless and prosper. So that covers just about everything. Sounds pretty good, like a good deal to me.
Yeah.
Now another thing he promises in verse 7, he says, the Lord will grant that enemies who rise up against you will be defeated before you. Now there's a number of things I want to say about this. First of all, I think in the immediate context, this is another extension of something out of the Abrahamic covenant. Because remember, he told Abraham, I'll bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse, in Genesis 12. So an enemy is somebody that's cursing them, so obviously he's going to curse that enemy if an enemy comes on them. But it's even more than that, because what he mentioned, when you see the way he words it, the Lord will grant that enemies who rise up against you will be defeated before you. The first thing is he is using that word grant, which means the people of Israel need to remember that when the enemies come against them and are defeated, it isn't their own strength, it isn't their own ability that's defeating those enemies. Who's defeating the enemies?
God.
God is defeating the enemies. In other words, the word grant is almost like another word for a gift. It's like God is giving them that victory. God is causing that victory. They can't defeat the enemy in their own strength. God will give them that victory. That's an important thing for all of us to realize. We cannot defeat the enemy on our own strength. But God has promised He will give us victory over that enemy, but it is Him who is granting the victory. The second thing is even this promise itself is essentially promising even to the faithful, even when we're talking about the people of God that are following Him, you will have enemies come against you. I think that's important for all of us to remember as God's children, as God's people. that when we become God's people, that does not mean that the enemies go away. It does not mean, like we've talked about before, the storms go away. There will still be enemies that will come against us. There will still be giants that come against us. There will still be storms. His blessings are not a promise that we will never have adversity. He does not promise that. He just promises that He will be there with us and He will give us the victory. As a matter of fact, I would say that the very presence of enemies coming against us is itself a sign of God's blessing. And you would say, how in the world could that be? Because the enemy attacks what is a threat to them. And the more faithful we are, the more we follow God, the more of a threat to the enemy that we are. The enemy doesn't have to attack something that isn't a threat. But if what we do because we are following God, or I should say what God is accomplishing through us, is a threat to His plans, that's when He's going to attack us. Let me give you an example, an analogy from the firearms world.
Of course.
Yes, of course. I've read a lot, seen some videos, and done some reading and studying. There's actually in the firearms community, there's debate over whether a person who's a firearms carrier should carry openly or carry concealed. There are a lot of people that say if you have a firearms license that you should just carry openly, and that way people know you can take care of yourself and they won't mess with you. And in many situations that's probably true. I'm sure that seeing someone who's packing is a deterrent. But there's another aspect to this, and that's the reason why so many people, really advocate concealed carry. Okay? Imagine you are an evildoer and you're going into a store or a restaurant or a stadium or wherever it is, and you want to shoot down some people and cause trouble. And you see all these people out there, and then you see one guy and you see he's carrying a gun.
That's your first target.
Who are you going to shoot first?
That's the first target.
You are the first target because you are the threat. You're the one guy that could take him out. And you don't know he's there with plans in his mind to cause problem, but he sees you and he knows you can take care of yourself. So the first bullet is right through your head. However, if you're concealed carry, he doesn't know you from anything. And now you have an advantage because then he doesn't know that once he starts shooting, that's when you can put a stop to him. And so my whole point of that analogy is that the bad guy attacks the threat first. So if God's people are obeying and following, then they are a threat to the enemy. And he will attack. And the historical evidence, yes, the enemy will attack God's people. So it's not a question of if, it's only a question of when and what happens. And God's essentially saying, because I am blessing you, that when the enemy attacks, he will not win. Not because you're strong, but because I'm strong. And I grant to you the victory. Verse 9, he says, the Lord will establish you as His holy people. So here we talk about that purely spiritual aspect of the relationship. It isn't just like a king over his people who are taking care of them in a materialistic sense and in a law enforcement or military protection sense. Though that's certainly, as we've seen, part of it. It is a spirit. There's a spiritual nature of it too, that we're His people. Or, of course, this is talking to Israel, that they are His holy people. And remember that what the whole word holy means, it means set apart. It's like of all at that time, probably millions. I don't know if by that time, if we'd ever gotten to 1 billion in population yet. I have no idea. But of all the hundreds of billions of people on earth, this group of people are separated out to belong to Him. His holy people. And so it speaks of this spiritual relationship, this love relationship, this unique one. It's different from the way God deals with any other people, of love and care. The people belong to God, as his children. Now, in those first 14 verses of chapter 28, there are a number of other specific statements and examples that he gives, but they generally fall within one of these categories that we talked about. You know, an example is like verses 11 and 12. The Lord will grant you abundant prosperity in the fruit of your womb, the young of your livestock, and the crops of your ground. Well, that's kind of a restatement of, you know, of what he said in the previous verse that we just talked about. So, in those verses, he does give some other examples, and he does repeat himself some. But almost all of the promises kind of fall into one of those categories. But I think the summary of it is the first thing he said: I will exalt the nation. Any questions about that? Okay, verse 15 is what begins Mosaic B.
Exhibit B.
This is the second track. And it begins with the statement, however.
Correlative conjunctions.
Thank you. That's what that means? If
Well,
and then however?
If and then. If correlative conjunctions just mean they go together, like there's one and another, not just however by itself, but if there's a if then or a not only but also, or they're correlative conjunctions.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
From the programming standpoint, this would be an if then else statement.
I guess that would still be correlative even though there's three of them,
Yes.
because they correlate, so.
So this is sort of Mosaic B. It's the second segment of this covenant. This, however, distinguishes this group of people that are going down this track from the other.
Yeah.
And so he says, if you do not obey the Lord your God and do not carefully follow all his commands and decrees. The word if, once again, presenting, so really it's for in a way, because now he's using the if again, presents the apparent conditionality of the covenant. You know, what follows are promises applying to the nation if and when it abandons God and disregards his law, and specifically in verse 14, turns to and serves other gods. And we know historically that was one of their biggest things during their times of disobedience, was kings that would go after, you know, and serve pagan gods of the, you know, of the other Palestinian gods there. So he says, all these curses will come upon you and overtake you in verse 15. Now this word curse, it is really an antonym. Am I using that term correctly?
Is it an opposite?
An opposite?
That would be
Yes.
an antonym.
It's essentially, in Hebrew, it's essentially the opposite of blessing. It's like everything blessing is, this is a not in front of it.
That would be an antonym, or an antithesis.
I'm not going to try to pronounce the Hebrew word there, but it basically means the opposite: to bring into contempt, to despise, to vilify. Everything that a blessing promises to give you, a curse promises to take it away, or not give it to you, or do the opposite to you. So what follows are the consequences for the nation for turning away from God. Now the interesting thing is, I think from a literary and poetic standpoint, it's very interesting because Moses uses very much parallel structure here. Because he uses essentially the same words, and he just takes bless out and puts curse in. It's like, it's just, it's almost the same statements. That's why I say it's like an antonym. It's the opposite.
Mm-hmm.
He says, you will be cursed in the city and cursed in the country, in verse 16. See, it's the same phrase, except cursed instead of blessed. And once again, it's a direct parallel, but it's an opposite statement from verse 3 regarding the extent to which the curse applies, which means, you know, if you know, the people in the cities lead God's people astray, it's going to affect even the people living out in the country, and vice versa. And that's important for us to remember as a nation, because again, we're talking national here. As a nation, you know, the consequences of a nation's course can affect everybody, even people that had nothing to do with it. Even the people who individually may not be to blame, we still suffer for those consequences when the nation goes in the wrong direction. You see what I mean? You see the distinction there? Even if it's not our fault, we can still be affected by it. Because overall as a nation, and we've seen that in America, haven't we?
Yeah.
Are good godly people suffering because of bad decisions that leadership has made? Of course. This is exactly what God's promising to the nation of Israel. Your basket and your kneading trough will be cursed, in verse 17. Parallel to verse 5, once again regarding the food and provisions. Instead of, your crops and your livestock and everything, instead of it being blessed, it'll be cursed, which means you're probably going to have pestilence. Your crops won't grow. You'll have droughts. Things like that. So it will be materialistically, they will struggle, which means they will struggle economically. They'll struggle as a people. Verse 18 says the fruit of your womb will be cursed. Once again, parallel to verse 4. Regarding how the population will grow, or in this case not grow. And I think that what this is essentially saying is that instead of your population growing, it'll begin to shrink. Maybe the death rate increases, the birth rate decreases, the babies born are not healthy and they don't survive. Basically instead of the population becoming stronger, the population withers. And therefore, as a nation, becomes less independent and powerful. Verse 18b, the crops of your land, like we were saying, parallel to verse 4, referring to the lack of provisions and prosperity. And then in verse 19, we see that parallel verse with what I said was kind of the Midas touch, that everything you do will be blessed. In verse 19, he says, you will be cursed when you come in and cursed when you go out. Essentially, he's telling the nation, if you don't follow me and you disobey me and you go after other gods, nothing you do will work. It just won't work. No matter what you do, you're going to get error code 404. It'll just freeze up and, the only thing you can do is reboot. It's like nothing you touch. Have you ever had days like that or weeks like that or years like that where it's just like nothing you touch works? Everything you touch fails. The computer crashes. Your phone doesn't work. Something in your house goes out. You've had times like that. I know I have.
Air conditioned snaps.
Yeah, That's essentially what he's telling this disobedient nation. Nothing you touch will work. Everything you do and everything you try to do will be like going uphill again, trying to push a boulder uphill. Now, beginning in verse 20 and continuing all through the rest of chapter 28, Moses lists for them specific examples and areas where blessings are removed and replaced by these curses, which affect almost every area of the people's lives. We're not going to go into all the specific examples. He gives a lot of specific examples. But just like before, they're really just elaborations and examples of those basic categories. Once again, the summary of it is, nothing you do will work, or nothing you touch will work or prosper. And so all those other examples he gives throughout the rest of chapter 28 are just examples of the things that are going to have problems with. And you can read those if you're curious, but they fall into those basic categories. When we get to chapter 29 and verse 1, this is where he it's another summary statement, but it's almost like the end summary statement. It's sort of the conclusion. He says, these are the terms of the covenant the Lord commanded Moses to make with Israel. So this summary statement concludes the specifics of this covenant and labels it as a covenant. Now, what follows in the remainder of chapter 29 are Moses preaches, let's just put it that way. He gives them the law, he gives them the covenant with the two possible tracks to go down, and then says, now we got to talk. And he preaches. And what he's essentially doing is, if you read it, it's like he's just begging the people, let's follow God. Here's our choice. Here's our choices. Let's follow God. He's called on them to be God's people, to follow God's laws. He wants them to hearken to this covenant that God established, because he wants to see them all going down Mosaic A and not B. So he all but begs. Okay? And so in chapter 30, we see, I alluded to this last week. I know that's small. I alluded to this last week, but this is something that I think is really important for us not to miss after talking about all these curses especially. This is a final promise that God makes to them of restoration and hope. He says in chapter 30, verses 1 and 2, "When all these blessings and curses I have set before you come upon you, and when you and your children return to the Lord your God and obey Him with all your heart and with all your soul." It's interesting that here God uses the word when, not if. Because in His omniscience, He already knows what's going to happen. He already knows, you go through the 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, He already knows this pattern that they're going to follow Him sometimes and they're going to disobey Him sometimes. He knows they're going to follow Him sometimes and not. He knows He's going to bless them sometimes and sometimes not. He knows that ultimately they're going to be disciplined and dispersed out of the land. Because of, we know eventually they're taken away into captivity in Assyria and Babylonia. But He also knows they will return to Him and obey Him. So this promise is the promise of what happens when the disobedient repent and return. And I think this is just as important a promise as any of those individual ones. Verse 3 says, "The Lord your God will restore your fortunes and have compassion on you and gather you again." Because you see, the curses of the covenant are not permanent. And they in duration or effect. Because He never ultimately abandons His people. In fact, we could say that those curses are forms of discipline. I think I mentioned this last week. They're not judgment. They're discipline, designed to get their attention and bring them back. And He promises to them that when they return, He will have compassion on them, He will give them love and mercy, and He will restore His people. Verse 5 even says, "He will bring you to the land that belonged to your fathers. He will make you more prosperous and numerous than your fathers." To me, this is almost like what He told Job. That God's going to give you back everything He took and then some. It's this promise of hope and restoration. So after all of those talkings about the cursings that God will put upon them if they don't obey Him, He says, "But ultimately I will restore you. I will put you back in the land. I will bless you. I will bless you even more than I blessed you before." There's this ultimate promise of restoration. God never gives up on His people. God is a God of hope and love and mercy, and He is just as much there when we return as He is when we're disobeying Him and He's having to spank us.
Like the prodigal son, like when he came
I was
back.
just
Yeah.
thinking that, the prodigal son, He's
They
the one that went away, but now He's
And
back.
they gave him the best robe, and even though
That's
he
exactly
was
what it is. It's exactly, that's very much a parable of this in many ways. And in verse 11 of chapter 30, he says, this is another very interesting and hopeful promise. He says, "Now what I am commanding you today is not too difficult for you or beyond your reach." I find this an interesting statement. We're so used to saying as New Testament Christians that we cannot follow the law, and that's why we needed Christ. And it's true, we can't follow the law. Even if we disobey it in one thing, we've disobeyed it in all, okay? But again, He's talking to the nation here. And He says, as a nation, you can follow me. He's not saying they have to be perfect, because we're not talking about individual here. We're talking as a nation. He says, it's not too hard for you. It's not beyond your ability. I'm giving you all the information you need. Okay, it's not too difficult. So, He's not saying the law can be observed in such a way that we can be saved through our own effort. He's just saying as a nation, we can be God followers. We can be His people. We don't have to be perfect, but it's not too difficult to follow God in our lives as a lifestyle. He's giving them hope that what He's demanding is something they can accomplish. And here's how. In verse 14, He says, "No, the word is very near you. It is in your mouth and in your heart, so you may obey it." He's making it clear that none of this is a mystery. God's not keeping anything from us. And none of it's hidden from them. None of it's beyond their understanding. They have the Word of God in their hearts and their minds. It's near to them. And then in verse 19 is the final exhortation of this covenant. He says, "This day I call heaven and earth as witnesses against you, that I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses." You know how anytime, there's an agreement or a contract, what do you always have to have? A witness, notary public or somebody. You witnessed for me and Deborah one time when we did our refinance, and they came to our house and did it, but you had to be there to witness it.
Mhm.
I'm not sure why that was, because that lawyer was a notary public too, but you had to witness something.
Yeah, I was, yeah.
So there's always got to be a witness in things like this. Well, who can be a witness for God? Well, none of us are qualified. So creation is the witness before God, Heaven and earth are His witnesses. And this is what sort of is the notary public seal on the covenant that makes it all legal. It sets before them, though, this choice, emphasizing that what happens from this point on is under their control. This principle demonstrates, I think, the hybrid nature of this conditional versus unconditional covenant. Because we can choose our actions. That's the conditional part. But we cannot choose our consequences. That's the unconditional part. We can choose the action, but we can't choose the consequence. We can't say we'll disobey, but we'll get away with it. The only part we can choose is our actions. So what does Moses say in verse 19b? "Now choose life, so that you and your children may live." He's calling on the people to make the right choice, to choose life. It almost sounds like a bumper sticker, doesn't it? To choose blessing instead of curses for themselves and for their descendants. And in verse 20, I think if this is not a t-shirt or a bumper sticker, it ought to be, "For the Lord is your life." That's his sort of summary statement, very brief but divinely wise. The Lord is your life. In other words, it's not just something you do on Sunday. It's not just rituals that you do. It's not just words that you do. It's just not things you dress up in. It's just not things that you pretend. It's not just a title that you put upon yourself. I'm this. The Lord is your life. I think about that Stephen Curtis Chapman song, "Jesus is Life."
Yeah.
In other words, He's the source of our life. He's everything. He's our everyday. He's the very blood going through our veins. He isn't just something we do sometimes. He is our life. He is the source of our life. He's the power source. And so if the Lord is our life, we will be His followers. And if God's people as a whole, as a nation, are His followers, then He will bless that nation in everything they do and everything they touch. So I think these last two statements are the things that we should take away from this. Now choose life, for the Lord is your life. I just love those statements. Mm-hmm. Those are sermons all by themselves. Mm-hmm. Now choose life. So, ends the Mosaic covenant. Next up will be the Davidic covenant.
Yeah.
The Davidic covenant. Wonder who that'll be about.